Montana Territory, late August of 1874, the heat clung to the earth like a second skin, and the sun was just starting to dip behind the distant crazy mountains when everything changed for Jessa Rae. She stood barefoot in the dirt behind the saloon in Elk Bend, arms crossed over her chest, trying to ignore the dry sting of the dust on her skin. Her brothers had promised they were just getting supplies. Instead, they had vanished into the saloon an hour ago, dragging her along like she was nothing more than a mule with legs. And now she saw it. Saw them. Saw her own blood Duncan and Merritt standing at the bar with a bottle of whiskey already half empty between them. And across from them, a man with a thick black beard and a silver star pinned to his vest looked her over like she was a side of beef. "She's strong," Duncan said, voice slurred. "Knows how to cook, clean, ride, ain't never had no man touch her. Worth more than a bottle, if you ask me." The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "You trading your sister for whiskey," Merritt laughed. "Why not? She's just sitting there, eating our food, taking up space. Might as well let someone else get some use out of her." Jessa's stomach turned. Her throat tightened. She took a step back, but her heel caught on a rock and she stumbled. The sheriff looked toward her, then back at the brothers. "You drunk fools are about to get thrown in jail." "No law against making a deal," Duncan said, raising his hands. Jessa's heart pounded in her chest. Her palms were sweaty, her breath shallow. They were really doing it. Her own kin. And then, from the saloon doorway, a man stepped out into the fading light. He wore a dust-covered hat pulled low, a dark red bandana hanging loose at his neck. Tall, broad-shouldered, and calm in a way that made everything around him go still. The kind of man who looked like the land itself, weathered, strong, unmovable. He walked slow, steady, until he stood between her and the men, facing them all. "You boys bartering women now?" he asked, voice even. "Or just your own kin?" Duncan scoffed. "What's it to you, cowboy?" The man looked to the sheriff, then to Jessa, his eyes held steady on hers. Blue eyes, clear as glacial water and so gentle she almost forgot to breathe. "She's not for sale," he said. Then he turned back toward the sheriff. "She's already spoken for. That's my bride." The word hit the air like a gunshot. The sheriff blinked. "Your bride," he nodded once. "Name's Gideon Oakes. We married in Bozeman, headed out to settle near the Shields River. Her brothers got her drunk on lies and dragged her here. She came to me for help yesterday, and I came to take her back." Jessa stared at him, lips parted. She had never seen this man before, but he looked at her like she mattered. Like she was not something to be traded or tossed aside. She stepped forward, slow, afraid to breathe wrong and ruin the spell. Then she stood beside him. She swallowed hard. "That's right," she said. "He's my husband." The sheriff looked between them. "You got a paper?" Gideon nodded. "Left it in my saddlebag." "You want to see it?" The sheriff exhaled, rubbing his face. "No, I believe you. Get her out of here." Duncan shouted something, but the sheriff shoved him back into his stool. "You two can sleep it off in the jailhouse. Might do you good." Gideon turned to Jessa. "You ready?" She nodded, mouth dry, heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. He walked her to his horse, a big bay gelding with a white blaze and saddlebags already packed. He helped her up, then swung up behind her, his arms around her waist. They rode out of the town in silence, the sky bleeding orange and purple, the wind cool against her face. When they were clear of Elk Bend and the road stretched empty ahead, she turned to him. "You lied for me," she whispered. "I did not lie," he said. "I just made something true before you had time to argue." She blinked. "I saw what they were doing. I was coming in for supplies when I heard them talking about you, saw your face through the window. You looked like you were drowning." He paused. "So I threw you a rope." She swallowed. "You do not even know me." "No," he said, "but I want to." They reached a small creek where the water ran clear and cold. He tied off the horse, pulled off his hat. They ate jerky and bread in silence, each watching the fire he built from dry pine and broken limbs. She could not stop glancing at him, the way he moved, quiet and sure. His hands were scarred, his voice steady. "You saved my life," she said, voice barely above the wind. "And you called me your bride." He looked at her, eyes soft in the firelight. "If you want, we can find a preacher." "Make it true." She hesitated, heart pounding. "You do not even know my name." He smiled, not smug, not proud, just soft. "Tell me then." She looked at him, really looked, and something in her chest unlocked. For the first time in years, she was not afraid. Jessa Rae Rylan, he held out his hand, palm up. Gideon Oakes, it is good to meet you, Jessa Rae. She slid her hand into his fingers closed around hers like they were meant to fit there. And in that moment, with the fire crackling and the moon rising above the trees, she did not feel like a burden or a girl left behind. She felt like somebody's bride. The frost came early that year. By the time Gideon and Jessa reached his homestead near the Shields River, the cottonwoods had already begun to yellow along the banks, and the mornings bit at the edges of her sleeves. The cabin stood low and solid against a rise, its roof shingled with cedar shakes and smoke curling steady from the stone chimney. He swung down first and helped her dismount, his grip warm through the worn leather of his gloves. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left Elk Bend, hadn't asked questions either. But now, with the cabin in sight and the silence between them stretching thin, she glanced toward him. "You built this yourself, every beam," he said. "Took 2 winters and part of a third." She stepped forward, her boots crunching over dry grass. The porch creaked under her weight and she paused at the door, glancing back once. He nodded, then pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled of pine and ash and something faintly sweet, like dried sage. The floor was swept clean, the table square and plain, with a single chair carved from cottonwood. A cot rested against the far wall, covered in a wool blanket the color of river rock. A second, smaller bedroll was folded near the hearth. "There's room," he said, setting her bag near the wall. "It isn't much, but it's honest." She ran her hand over the edge of the table. "No one else lives out here, no neighbors for 5 miles. Closest town's Livingston, half a day's ride if the river's low." Jessa turned slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "You meant it, didn't you? Back in Elk Bend." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I don't say things I don't stand by." She gave a small nod, then lowered herself onto the edge of the cot. "I never thought I'd end up in a place like this. Let alone with a man I'd never met before noon yesterday." He didn't move, just watched her with that quiet steadiness he carried in everything he did. "You want to return to Bozeman, I'll take you, or farther if you have kin elsewhere." "I don't," she said. "Just the 2 that left me behind." The words sat between them like a shadow. She didn't cry, didn't fidget, just sat still, her gaze fixed on the worn floorboards. "You can stay as long as you want," he said. "You don't owe me anything." She looked up. "You'd let a stranger live under your roof just like that? You're not a stranger anymore." He stepped farther into the room and unrolled the spare bedding near the hearth. "You'll have the cot." "I'll take the floor." "You don't have to do that, I know." She watched him smooth the blanket with slow, deliberate hands. The firelight flickered across the side of his face, carving lines she hadn't noticed before. He looked older in that light, not in years but in weight, like he had lived more winters than most. "What brought you out here?" she asked. He stood, brushing wood dust from his trousers. "Left Kentucky after the war, thought I'd find peace in open land. Something clean to build with my own hands." Her voice was quieter now. "Did you?" "Some days," he said. "Other days it's just quieter out here, doesn't mean the past stays gone." She nodded once, then leaned back against the cot post. The fire popped, sending a small ember drifting across the hearthstone. "I never had a man speak for me before," she said after a while. "Not once. You shouldn't have needed it." She looked at him for a long time. "You didn't hesitate." "No," he said. "Didn't see the sense in waiting." She didn't reply. Just swung her feet up onto the cot and lay down, her back to the wall and her face turned toward the dying light of the fire. After a moment, he moved to the hearth and stirred the coals, adding a split log with practiced care. Then he lay down on the pallet, his boots to the side, his hat resting against the wall. Outside, the wind shifted through the tall grass, and a coyote called somewhere beyond the ridge. Inside, the only sound was the soft breath of 2 people learning how to be near one another. Neither of them slept right away. But when sleep did come, it came quiet and without weight, like the first snow that falls without a sound. By early October, the first thin snow had traced the ridgeline above the river, and the aspens lost their gold to bare branches. The days shortened, and the wind took on a voice low and constant, like something old whispering through the gullies. Jessa had taken to splitting kindling in the mornings. She used the smaller axe, not because she was told to, but because it felt right, something steady her hands could do while the sky warmed itself from ice to gray. Gideon never hovered. He'd be out by the river with his traps or checking the snare line near the north bluff. He always returned by midday, a rabbit slung over his shoulder or a few trout strung through the gills. One afternoon, she found him oiling the hinges on the barn door, his sleeves rolled up and his fingers black with grease. "You always work quiet like that?" she asked, leaning on the fence rail just enough to feel the sun touch her back. He glanced up, eyes squinting. "No sense in making noise when you're trying to listen." "To what?" He nodded toward the ridge. "Anything that doesn't belong." She folded her arms. "You expecting trouble?" "Not expecting, just never stopped noticing." He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, then met her eyes. "You ever do that, watch for things before they come?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped down from the rail, boots sinking into soft earth. "Back in Missouri, I used to sleep with a knife under my pallet, not because anybody told me to, just seemed smart." "You ever use it?" "No, but I sharpened it every week." They stood a few paces apart, the wind shifting Gideon's collar and brushing her hair across her shoulder. "You want to learn to shoot?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "You teach me, if you want to." She nodded once. "I do." He led her behind the barn, where a pair of bottles sat lined on a fence post. The rifle he handed her was long and worn, the wood smooth from years of use. "Recoil'll knock you back if you're not set right," he said, stepping behind her. "Feet shoulder width, lean in a little." She adjusted, biting the inside of her cheek in concentration. He didn't touch her, just let his voice guide her low, even. When she fired, the bottle shattered clean, the sound sharp against the quiet hills. She lowered the rifle, blinking from the kick. "That one yours?" "No," he said. "That one's yours." She looked over her shoulder, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You always this good at teaching?" He shrugged. "Only ever taught myself, figured I'd try it out on somebody who listens." They practiced until the light stretched long across the dry grass. She missed a few, hit more. When the bottles were gone and her shoulder ached gentle from the recoil, she handed the rifle back. "You're not like most men," she said. He leaned the rifle against the fence post. "You say that like it's a warning or a compliment." "I haven't decided yet." He grinned, not wide, just a slow lift of his mouth that stayed mostly in his eyes. They walked back toward the cabin as the sky deepened to blue. Her hands were cold, but she didn't mention it. He'd noticed, she figured, if it mattered. Inside, the fire had banked low. She crouched to stir it, adding a few pieces of dry pine. "You ever been married?" she asked without looking up. "No, why not?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Didn't know what I'd give someone, had land." "Had quiet, but not much else." She straightened and turned. "Seems to me that's more than most." He stepped closer, brushing wood dust from his palms. "What about you?" She shook her head. "Wasn't allowed to think about that." "Whenever I did, somebody was always deciding something for me." He didn't ask more. Just nodded and moved to the table, where he unwrapped the last of the smoked fish. They ate without much talking, just the sound of tin forks on pewter plates and the fire crackling soft behind them. Later, she stood by the window, watching the stars blink through the cold glass. "I used to wish for things when I was little," she said, voice low, "even after I knew better." He was still at the table, hands folded, eyes on her. "What kind of things?" "Someone who'd see me. Not just walk past." She turned, the hem of her skirt brushing the floorboards. "You didn't know me, still don't, not really, but you saw me." He stood, slow and sure. "I did." They stood a breath apart, the firelight catching the edge of her jaw. "If we find a preacher," she said, her words careful, "I want it to be because we meant to." He didn't reach for her, just let the quiet stretch long between them. "I'd rather build something slow than claim something I haven't earned," he said, her mouth lifted, soft and certain. "Then you better plan to stay a while." "I already did." That night, he unrolled his bedroll again, and she lay on the cot, facing the hearth. Neither said good night. But sleep came easier, and when she woke near dawn, she found his coat draped over her legs. the scent of pine smoke and worn leather wrapped around her like a promise. A week after the first frost, Gideon handed her a trowel and nodded toward the root cellar door behind the cabin. "We'll need to finish burying the squashes before the ground hardens. Beets, too." Jessa tucked her braid beneath her scarf and followed him into the morning chill. The sun had barely crested the treetops, and the grass still held a layer of brittle white. She knelt and began scraping out the shallow trench they'd started 2 days earlier, the soil cold but pliant. Beside her, Gideon worked without hurry, sleeves rolled and breath fogging in the air. They said little, but the rhythm of the work settled into something easy. No need to fill silence that wasn't heavy. When they finished, she stood and brushed dirt from her skirt. "You've got more order in your winter stores than most towns I've seen." His mouth curved faintly. "I don't take well to hunger." She followed him back toward the cabin, her boots leaving prints in the frost-softened earth. "What was Kentucky like?" He opened the door and let her enter first. Green, crowded. Never felt like there was enough air. She drew a kettle from the hook and poured what was left of yesterday's boiled water. "You left on your own." "My brother went west first, sent letters, said the land here didn't ask questions." She set the kettle on the stove and turned. "You still write him?" "No, he didn't stay long. California took him." She folded her arms. "You never followed. I'm not built for chasing gold. I'd rather plant something and wait." Later that afternoon, she stood at the edge of the property line, her shawl pulled tight, watching the stretch of sky above the ridge. A hawk circled, catching the last thermals before dusk. Behind her, boots crunched softly. "You thinking of leaving?" Gideon asked. She shook her head. "No, just thinking." He stood beside her, his hands at his sides. "You miss anything?" "Apricots," she said. "There was a tree behind the boarding house I worked in. Never bore much, but when it did, I'd climb the back fence and eat them before they hit the ground." He glanced at her. "You ever think about planting one?" She watched the hawk disappear behind the trees. "Not till now." That night, while she mended a tear in her hem beside the fire, he carved something from a piece of cedar. The sound of the blade on wood was steady, and she didn't interrupt until he held it out to her. It was a small bird, wings folded, head tilted. "It's not much," he said. She turned it over in her palm, thumb tracing the grain. "It's the first thing anyone's made for me that wasn't meant to keep me silent." Later, while she washed the basin, she asked without turning, "Do you want a family?" "I want a home," he said. "If people come with it, I won't turn them away." She set the basin aside. "I don't know what kind of wife I'd make." His voice came from behind her, close but not touching. "You already are. In every way that counts." When she turned, he was watching her the way he had in Elk Bend, steady, without pressure. "I'd marry you again," she said, quiet and clear. "Only this time I'd walk toward it." He stepped forward just once. "Then let's do it right." She nodded. "Tomorrow, tomorrow." And in the stillness between them, something old unlatched, not rushed, not wild, just sure. Outside, the wind shifted and the stars came out one by one. Inside, she reached for his hand and didn't let go. The preacher rode in just after sunrise, his coat buttoned high against the wind, his gelding lathered from the long push-up from the valley. Gideon met him at the edge of the trail, hand offered without ceremony. "Cabin's just ahead," he said. "We've got warm bread and coffee." The preacher, a man in his 50s with a face weathered like barnwood, dismounted stiffly. "That's more than I got in Livingston last night." Jessa waited by the door, shawl drawn around her shoulders, a single cornflower tucked behind her ear. She'd found it still blooming near the creek bend and brought it back without a word. When Gideon saw it, he didn't say anything either, just looked at her like nothing in the world could be more fitting. Inside, the fire was already going strong, and the table had been cleared to make room. She'd scrubbed the floor that morning, folded their bedding, and swept the space until the scent of pine dust and hearth smoke settled like a second skin. "You sure you want to do this out here?" the preacher asked, warming his hands over the stove. "I can take you to town." "We've got a chapel." Jessa folded her hands. "Town didn't see me when it mattered. This place did." The preacher gave a quiet nod, then opened his book and cleared his throat. They stood side by side, No audience but the wind rattling the eaves and the small sparrow carving circles through the sky beyond the window. Gideon didn't take her hands until the preacher asked him to. When he did, his fingers were warm and steady, rough from work and shaped by purpose. Her palms fit into his like they'd been waiting for that moment all their life. "Do you come to this union with a willing heart?" the preacher asked. "I do," Gideon said, eyes never leaving hers. "And you, Jessa?" She didn't blink. "I do." The words were simple. There was no ring. Just the silence that followed, soft and wide, and the feel of Gideon's thumb brushing once across the back of her hand as if he couldn't help the motion. The preacher closed his book. "By the laws of this territory and the strength of your own choosing, your husband and wife. May the seasons be kind to you." They didn't kiss right away. Gideon just looked at her, then leaned forward and pressed his brow to hers, the way a man might lean toward water after a long, hard ride. She closed her eyes and leaned back into him. The preacher stayed long enough to finish his coffee and tuck a heel of bread into his saddlebag. Before he left, he turned to Jessa. "You've got a good one," he said. She nodded. "So does he." The snow came heavier that night. They stayed indoors, the wind howling through the trees like it had a bone to pick. Gideon pulled the bench close to the fire, and she sat beside him with her knees drawn up beneath her skirt. He handed her a folded bundle wrapped in linen. "Found it at the mercantile 2 weeks ago. Wasn't sure if I had the right color." She opened it slowly. Inside was a length of wool dyed deep blue, the kind that would keep its warmth even wet. Her throat tightened. "I've never had anything bought just for me. You do now." She folded it across her lap, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "You never asked me to become anything I wasn't." "I didn't want a shape to fill," he said. "I wanted a life to build." When she looked up at him, his eyes held no questions, just a quiet knowing that settled deep and sure. Later, when the fire burned low and the wind had softened to a hush, he reached for her hand again. This time, she laced their fingers without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, they learned each other by seasons instead of words. He showed her how to read the sky for snow, how to mend a saddle strap, how to listen for the weight of a storm before it broke. She showed him how to stretch flour without spoiling texture, how to sew a seam that wouldn't pull, how to find the right words when grief rose like smoke from old ash. They planted plum seeds in the spring. Not apricot Montana wouldn't take apricot well, but she didn't mind. She'd carved a small scar into the post where they exchanged their vows, just deep enough to remember, not deep enough to draw blood. One morning, after the last thaw, Gideon found her standing barefoot outside the cabin, her hands resting over the soft swell beneath her dress. She looked over her shoulder and smiled, not wide, just enough to say everything without saying it. He walked to her slowly, the grass still damp with dew, and rested his palm on top of hers. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "Sure as spring." He kissed her then, the way a man kisses his home, not with hunger but with awe. They stayed on that land for years, through lean winters and blooming summers, never leaving, never needing to. Folks would pass through and ask about the carved sparrow over their doorframe or the thick plum trees that bloomed too early some years. But no one ever asked twice why she stayed, or why he built the cabin so far from the road. It was plain enough in the way they looked at each other across the table, or how their hands found one another even after decades of knowing. And when the time came, they were buried side by side beneath the same cottonwood, wrapped in the same wool she'd worn that first winter. But before that, oh, long before that, there were years of laughter by the fire and children's voices in the grass, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken because it's written into the wood grain of a home, the tilt of a head, the weight of a hand resting quietly against another. They had chosen each other once, and they kept choosing every day after.